Between 1934 and 1961, Arnold Toynbee published his magnus opus, A Study of History. It is a universal interpretation of all of history's major civilizations and the cyclical patterns they are destined to endure. It was initially released to critical acclaim, but has been virtually ignored by modern historians, and now, rarely cited, it has been left to gather dust. Toynbee posited that national history was not an intelligible field of study, and that the correct unit of historical inquiry was the civilization. Investigating the origins of all known civilizations, Toynbee concluded that they were born from a process of challenge and response, where the focus of a society shifted from ancestor worship to the celebration of those who developed new ideas and techniques. The breakdown of a civilization begins when this creative minority devolves into a dominant political minority, concerned only with maintaining its grip on power. The society becomes less harmonious and loses its self-determination. The decaying civilization is likely to enter a time of troubles, dominated by internal conflict before these altercations are extinguished by the establishment of a universal state. The Roman Empire, for example, emerged as a universal state of Hellenic civilization, which itself became the ancestor of Western Christendom. While the West has certainly passed through its time of troubles, it was spared the fate of a universal Leviathan, as a considerable portion of the West had emerged unscathed in the form of the United States of America. But in 1945, the West did stand on the brink of a new financial system.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
Bretton Woods laid down formal rules governing financial relations between the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Canada, and Australia, which included the adoption of the gold standard. The post-war period was a golden age for the United States, as its industrialized competition had all been bombed into ruins, enabling it to dominate global manufacturing and trade, while the glamour of 50s Hollywood spread its cultural message far and wide. Alongside Bretton Woods, the United Nations was founded, a replacement for the defunct League of Nations, in the hope that in the future countries might solve their differences amicably. With the building of the Berlin Wall and the rise of Mao in China, these hopes faded quickly. The shadow of the Cold War had enveloped the globe, and with ideology now the defining factor in alignment, the world became divided into three worlds: the free, the communist, and the third. Galvanized by the challenge of the USSR, the question of a universal state seemed off the table. But for how long? The wholesome glow of the 50s soon faded as the West began to show signs of psychological exhaustion, a PTSD of the collective consciousness, a consequence of the devastation of 2 world wars in half a century. This manifested in an episode of reflection and soul-searching, which culminated in the cultural oscillations of the 1960s. From the United States emerged a radical youth movement which spread across the West. From campus protests for free speech at Berkeley to anti-Vietnam War demonstrations at Kent State, the baby boomer generation began to make its presence felt. The social changes that occurred were dramatic, rapid, and permeated throughout the free world. With hindsight, it seems that 2 distinct philosophies drove these cultural upheavals. The primary and older force was the completion of the humanist liberal project, born from the quills of Voltaire and John Stuart Mill, and embodied by the civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The other was the rebirth of the Marxist project using the ideas of Berkeley professor Herbert Marcuse, the de jure philosopher for student radicals who participated in the 1968 Paris riots. Marcuse had recognized that the working class were not in a revolutionary stage, and alternative dialectics needed to be the focus of left-wing radicals, i.e., those of gender and race.
Done a lot in your writings to try to marry Freudianism and Marxism. And I think that some people would say that this simply can't be done because the two patterns of explanation are incompatible with each other. I mean, to put it extremely briefly, Marxist theory locates the ultimate level of explanation of human affairs in technique. The theory, put very simply, is that the level of development of the means of production in a society at any given time determine the formation of classes in that society, and that in turn determines the relationships of individuals to each other, and on that basis grow up what Marxists call a superstructure of ideologies, religions, philosophy, art, and so on. Now, according to Freud, something entirely different is the ultimate explanation of human behavior. The ultimate explanation, according to him, lies in the repressed contents of the unconscious, our unconscious wishes, fantasies, fears, feelings, and so on, which are repressed as a result of distortions in our earliest relationships, above all with our parents. And he explains not only social behavior, but also ideologies, art, religion, and so on, in terms of the externalization of the repressed contents of the psyche. Now, these are two entirely different kinds of explanation of the same set of phenomena. How can you possibly marry the two into a single theory?
I think they can easily be married, and it may well be a very happy marriage. I think they are two extremely different interpretations of two different levels of the same whole, the same totality.
Attacking the very foundations of liberalism in a critique of pure tolerance, his ideas began to permeate Western academia and were adopted by many protégés within the academy, including Angela Davis, despite being given early indications of the sort of results that can be expected when these ideas are put into practice.
And against all reason, today the Jonestown story got much worse.
The original count of persons found dead at the Jonestown site has been found to be seriously in error. It now appears there may be as many as 780 bodies total found at the site. They were found simply buried under other bodies. There were larger adults that were grouped together, and under their bodies were found the bodies of smaller adults and children.
How is it possible that you can walk around and lift bodies up and not see it? It's so incredible.
When we were out there originally, there were bodies under bodies as we were working.
On the international stage, Cold War confrontations, from Cuba to Vietnam, compounded and aggravated the domestic turmoil the US experienced during this decade. The US Army became further embroiled in the nationalist uprising turned ideological proxy war that Vietnam became, and the golden age of the United States was clearly over.
Live around it.
All of it began the first time some of you who know better and are old enough to know better let young people think that they had the right to choose the laws they would obey as long as they were doing it in the name of social protest.
In 1972, a team of computer scientists at MIT produced a computer simulation called World 3 that provided the basis for the Club of Rome's first report to its members, Limits to Growth. The model predicted a significant decline in industrial capacity and global capacity in the early 21st century. This report was not only a watershed moment in the birth of the environmental movement, but also an example of the increasing influence of international NGOs on the political process. In a survey of 502 US government officials serving from 1945 to 1972, more than half were revealed to be members of the Council of Foreign Relations, a foreign policy think tank founded in 1921. A number of other influential and international NGOs were formed in the post-war era, including the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, and the World Economic Forum. This set a trend for the increase in influence of cosmopolitan private member clubs over elected national governments. The 1970s were defined by an increasingly dystopian vision of the future. Having defaulted from the gold standard in 1971, the US then stumbled into the oil crisis of 1973.
This is NBC Nightly News, Wednesday, October 17th. Reported by John Chancellor.
Good evening. The Middle East war produced developments all over the world today. The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories. If the Arab countries keep that pledge, it would reduce their production by almost 50% in 1 year.
Events seemed to vindicate the doom-mongers that the end was nigh. Throughout the 70s, Britain suffered from stagflation and a brain drain as the upwardly mobile began to abandon the sick man of Europe. The close of the decade saw the winter of discontent bring down the Callaghan government and paved the way for the Thatcherite Revolution. In America, the hostage situation at the embassy in Tehran was a crucial catalyst for the downfall of the Carter administration. And as a new decade dawned on the West, both Britain and America turned to a new kind of leader, both of whom firmly rejected the concept of managed decline.
You wanted law and order in this town. You've got it.
Thatcher and Reagan found natural allies in one another and invigorated the special relationship that bonded their two countries.
I may sum up. This has been a tremendously successful visit, and one which we shall long remember, both in our minds and in our hearts.
Thank you very much. And again, let me just finish by saying that this has been a most important meeting for us and a very heartwarming experience every minute that we've been here. And we leave strengthened with the knowledge that the great friendship, the great alliance that has existed for so long between our two peoples, the United Kingdom and the United States, remains and is, if anything, stronger than it has ever been.
Both shared a conviction that the Soviet Union could and should be confronted rather than contained. Both advocated the neoliberal economic policies of the Chicago and Austrian schools of thought in opposition to the Keynesian approach, which had brought the West stagnation and inflation. This allowed the West to regain some of the competitiveness it had lost in relation to the rising Asian economies, including Japan.
We're reminded of the many traditions of openness and democracy that have marked the history of this city. Amir missed me.
In 1980, Reagan won a landslide election with an electoral college vote that is unlikely to be repeated anytime soon. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan provided the perfect opportunity for the Americans to give the USSR its Vietnam, and détente was rejected for a more aggressive foreign policy. British victory in the Falklands War provided another example of the West's willingness and ability to use military force to maintain international order. That war having been fought on the legal basis that UN members don't use force to settle disputes, rather than any territorial claim on the island. Toynbee postulated that a decaying civilization would go through a cycle of rout and rally as it declined. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the liberation of Eastern Europe in 1989, the misery of the 1970s and the Cold War appeared to be over. Many thought this was a new golden age for the West. Francis Fukuyama's end of history was the intellectual vogue of the time, with its thesis that liberal market forces have won the day and a new paradigm of peace, cooperation and prosperity beckoned. Thatcher and Reagan were replaced by John Major and Bush Sr. respectively, but neither candidate could reproduce their predecessors' electoral success long term. Both countries began to move simultaneously towards a softer, more centre-left political position under Clinton and Blair. Blair, elected in 1997, had learned from the election strategy of Clinton in his 1993 campaign. Both benefited from favourable economic circumstances, partly due to the peace dividend delivered by the end of the Cold War. But while the 90s will be remembered as a time of hedonism and economic growth, the material prosperity was not spread evenly across the generations. Much of the 90s economic growth in the US and UK was driven by a real estate boom. This enriched the baby boomers, many of whom were already on the property ladder, at the expense of their millennial children. House prices rapidly outpaced wage increases until inheritance became the only realistic way for many young people to become homeowners. During the 90s, domestic issues took priority over foreign affairs, as the now unipolar world felt much safer than during the Cold War years, when it had teetered on the cliff edge of nuclear annihilation. But there were some who saw trouble ahead. In 1996, Samuel P. Huntington published Clash of Civilizations. This built upon the work of the likes of Toynbee and Oswald Spengler, and argued that the Cold War had been merely an interruption or overlay to rivalries between civilizations that would now once again come to the fore. In response to his former pupil Fukuyama's ideas, Huntington recognized not only the potential future challenges from competition between civilizations, but also that of internal insurrection. He within academia saw nothing in the West but Western crimes, and they began to form an unholy alliance with so-called Davos-man, this latter moniker having been coined by Huntington to describe the new international elite of gold-collar bankers and industrialists who make up a plutocratic oligarchy that increasingly sets the agenda for democratically elected national politicians.
We have here our headquarters. We have also offices in Beijing and in New York. What we are doing is very complex. We are a foundation bringing together the key decision makers from all walks of life to address the challenges on the global agenda. We have business, of course, as a very important audience, and we have politics. We have continuous partnerships with many governments around the world. And of course, we have NGOs, we have trade unions, we have all those different parts. Media, of course, and very important experts and scientists and academia. Because if we are looking at the future, I think we should look at new solutions, and the new solutions will be very much driven by technological developments.
And you even have religious leaders, right?
We have religious leaders, we have social entrepreneurs, very important social entrepreneurs. Our young global leaders are selected by the top editors-in-chief around the world.
Okay. Can we continue? Can you?
Yes, of course.
What can we see? What else?
Just you show. Here's a group, and
good morning.
Good morning. I don't know what you are talking about now.
Middle East.
Middle East. Yeah. You see, what can we do? The group is we are just now looking what we can do for the Middle East.
Needless to say, Huntington's warnings were not heeded, and the West entered the 21st century full of optimism. But reality has a habit of shattering illusions.
Wow. Oh, yeah. Wow.
September the 11th was a wake-up call to the West, but their response to it would lead to overstretch both at home and abroad. The widely supported war in Afghanistan was followed by the divisive war in Iraq and the mysteriously not so divisive but equally destructive war in Libya. The latter almost completely destroyed arguably the most developed of the Arab nations, despite Gaddafi's abandonment of weapons of mass destruction programs and its architect, the sainted Barack Obama, being a Nobel Peace Laureate. Internal overreach came in the form of Alan Greenspan's lowering of interest rates to avoid recession after 9/11, along with a general attitude of economic short-termism, which culminated in the banking crash of 2008 and the birth of the Occupy movement. Fueled by righteous anger at the privatization of profits and socialized losses, what at first seemed like the potential vehicle for left-wing radicalism will now be remembered as more of a moment than a movement. The initial energy was quickly exhausted as the unwieldy mass movement failed to define its goals. If Occupy achieved anything, it was that its implosion provided a catalyst for the fracturing and polarizing of political allegiances that became the theme of political discourse from 2011 onwards. Since its emergence from academia into mainstream commentary, the culture war has penetrated all aspects of politics, creating exponential growth in alternative media as a rival to the corporate press. With the latter's bias exposed in scandals from Gamergate to the Covington kids, public trust in established media institutions disintegrated across the West from 2011 to 2020. The election of Donald Trump.
Of course, there's Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been saying that he will run for president as a Republican, which is surprising since I just assumed he was running as a joke.
And the Brexit referendum ignited the tinderbox of Western political animosities, and many countries in the West now face a serious risk of balkanization. College campuses, such as Berkeley, that had been the site of passionate free speech rallies a generation ago, are now the battlefields of censorial tribal warfare. It is becoming more and more obvious that the West has floundered, its troubles compounded by a precarious financial position. The cycle has gone from rout to rally to rout, but is another rally possible? The West's major challenger, China, has seemingly gone from strength to strength, spreading its economic influence around the globe through its Belt and Road program. This, combined with development of a military capability that has seriously disrupted American hegemony in the South China Sea, now makes an invasion of Taiwan almost inevitable. The Chinese Communist Party's disregard for individual rights, combined with its dystopian social credit system,
红色是表示你的专注力显示得很高。
Teachers at this primary school in China
蓝色是走神了，
know exactly when someone isn't paying attention.
白色 就是你可能跟网络还没有连接好。
These headbands measure each student's level of concentration. The information is then directly sent to the teacher's computer and to parents.
Is a metaphorical boot stamping down on a human face for 1,000 years. No one alive today has ever lived in a world not dominated by the West, and only time will tell what that world will be like. But it is unlikely to be one in which the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, and a potential economic fallout from that transition may bring to a close over 300 years of Western cultural and economic hegemony.